Hey everybody, Chris Pugh here. Same t-shirt, different day. Just wanted to kind of go over this. I know I talked about it in one of my last entries here about sort of the overall hybrid rig setup as far as the mixing some analog gear with the digital mixing console system that I've got going on. I'd made mention to one little piece that I really wanted to just sort of talk about in detail. It's kind of one of the little bit more not really advanced, but kind of unique pieces and just kind of the way that I'm doing some stuff. So let me just kind of go ahead and pop out of this crazy little Apple monitor camera screen here, and we'll go right into some of the content. So what we're looking at here is um, analog summing, the analog summing piece. So practical application using digital console and converter IO. So really what that is basically looking at one piece in that analog rack in particular, which is going to be, if I can get this to actually advance correctly. There we go. All right, so this is it, the Rupert Neve Designs Satellite 5059. And what that is, just in detail, is a 16 input by 2+2 summing mixer, as it says right there on the left-hand side. So what does that mean? So basically it can take up to 16 inputs of line level signal, and those can be assigned to one of two discrete stereo buses available, and they can be pan straight up center, or they can be pan hard left right, or some variation of that. So what you'll notice is that I have some labels made for pairs, because it's getting to the point where, since I'm using all 16 of these inputs, I'm basically just trying to help myself out by kind of remembering what's what and where. So that way, if I want to actually do any group mixing, say in the physical domain off to my right hand side, I can just kind of look over and see what's what. So, you notice a couple of kind of quirky little names there. Good cop, bad cop. That's basically referring to the drum parallel path. So all the drums plus the overheads and hi-hat mics are all in the good cop. Bad cop is the same close mics on the drums, no cymbal mics though. So no overheads, no hi-hats. And that's the one, that's the parallel path. So that's the one that's getting absolutely demolished with a ton of compression. I've actually got some visual examples a little later on of what some of that stuff looks like as far as some group processing. And then stereo guitars, followed by stereo bands. So that's basically anything that is not a guitar, but also not a vocal. So that spits out there into 7 and 8. 9, 10, we've got BGV, so background vocals. And then after that, two mono group outputs that are part of this summing structure here. So that is mono bass and then mono lead vocal, followed by the last four channels, which are stereo vocal effects and stereo drum effects, that all come down and get mixed with the last four line inputs on this unit. So that's what we're looking at kind of overall. Just a quick note on that. As I mentioned, this has two different stereo buses. So what I'm doing is I'm actually taking advantage of both stereo 1 here, using that with the mouse pointer, and then stereo 2. So stereo 1 is everything band associated. So that's the drums, guitars, bands, and drum effects. Those are all assigned here. Anything and bass, obviously, as well. And then anything vocal related, BGVs, lead vocal, vocal effects, that all goes here to stereo 2. So basically, I'm using 4 total outputs, or 2 stereo outputs here, to drive so this is the band fader, and then this is the vocal fader. One nice thing about this particular unit, they have the Silk hybrid transformer saturation options, and it is discrete per bus. So I'm using Silk blue on the band and Silk red on the on the vocal group. All right. So moving on a little bit here, how does it work? So just kind of got another image of the rack as just kind of visual fodder here and as potential demonstration aid. So we're gonna as I mentioned, these are outputs of subgroups or groups or subgroups as it would be on the console to the analog input. So at that point, we output them from the console it's coming from, and that is taking place through that converter that I went over in some of my last demonstration. So that is so outputting there, and they are going in here to the line inputs on the back of this unit. And then looking at this, mixing these sources via onboard level and pan controls. I kind of went over that in on the last screen. So yeah, for all intents, each one of these red knobs are faders, potentiometers. So they are level control for those line inputs that I have now put into this mix domain. And then I also spoke about this very recently, assigned to a single or multiple stereo buses to an output drive path. So that's what's going on here. Again, this is the left-right band fader. This is the left-right vocal fader. So one of the things that I kind of allow that to sort of separate with is that it lets me have very different treatments. Not only am I using different types of hybrid transformer saturation, blue and red. If you're familiar with them, you're aware that they have a very, very different type of tonal character that they are going to embark upon the material that's being passed through them. So that's one way. Additionally, because they are discrete pairs of outputs, the band one is actually going through these next two pieces of things here. So this is the Varimu compressor. And then that is also output into this little creamliner tube saturation and EQ piece. So yeah, right now the vocal one is just getting the red silk treatment here. However, there is some process going on upstream, both in software and specifically on the lead vocal in terms of hardware. So as you may have followed along in some of my other videos, these first 5 units here, 545, IGS 1176 Blue Stripe, IGS LA2A type, opto circuit, 542 Rupert Neve designs, and then the 551 diode bridge, or I'm sorry, just regular 3-band equalization module. Those are all that is basically the contents of the lead vocal chain. So between that and then doing some things with the background vocals in the software domain, there's already some stuff happening there. So it's not like it's just I'm just spitting the vocals just straight out and without any processing happening. There's something going on. It's just happening upstream. So for the time being, this is getting output straight back in and where we merge in, which I'll kind of go in between how that and the band happens in just a little bit. So let's just take a little bit of a detailed look at the back of this unit. So this is what we're looking at here when we actually want to actually connect things both to the inputs and the output side. So first off, the most prominent piece of this, 16 available line inputs via 2 DB25 connectors. So that's the top left, reading left to right. That's the top pairs of what we're looking at here. So this is 1 through 8. This is 9 through 16. All we're looking at here and this on this side, this is just a visual schematic and diagram of this is how the pins are configured on those DB25s per channel. You see your block of 8 there. And then this is just a representation of where the positive, negative, and ground polarities are on each one of those type of connections per pin. So you'll notice that our odd pins that are in this particular configuration are set up positive, negative, ground this way. Our even pins that would be in this orientation are here, positive, negative, ground. All right. So again, just kind of going back over that, 2 discrete stereo bus drives. So we talked about that a little bit. And then now the insert, send, and return per channel also on the DB25 connector. So that's what's going on here. So if you want to use, say, analog gear, or I'm going to go into the software realm here in just a little bit about how this incorporates. We've got insert send and return also corresponding directly with those pairs, with those groups of 8 channels. So you can either do a direct correspondence by keeping it all contained pin to pin with DB type connectors, or you can break these things out a little bit and go into XLR, and that gives you the options of maybe chaining some gear together and making multiple processes for different types of group or stem processing. So that's basically, top down, we're essentially looking at, so inputs 1 through 8, send 1 through 8, return 1 through 8. So that's what we have here. We basically have an input point and then a send return for inserts on those. Same thing here with 9 through 16. Okay, so looking at it here, I know I've got this big giant letter or text box here, but just to kind of show you an overview. So this is what I'm looking at when I'm just looking at my overall console piece. This is kind of what it looks like from the top, and you'll notice that these names correlate directly with what I have directly on the summing mixer, because these are the things that are actually going to get, these are the things that are actually going to get spit out to get to hit the levels, panning, and drive from the satellite. One thing I did want to make note of, even though this is kind of covering this, which is really only covering kind of the metering section, but just a couple of things to note here on this is that you'll notice that I actually have these inserts on, and you'll notice that the outs are not assigned to anywhere. If you can take a look and see that. So I'm actually taking that signal out from this point, insert B. Every Digico input or bus offering, or matrix for that matter, all have 2 insert points. You can use one or the other at a time. So you'll notice that I'm taking it from B at this point because it's post-processing. If I ever need to dive in here and use any of the console-based units for anything, that's always going to happen before the point where it actually takes it out. So another thing that this kind of illustrates is what I'm about to go into here, which is, as I mentioned prior to, we've got the ability to use some hardware for group or stem processing in the external domain. But if you're like me and you're out of rack space and may not want to put all that additional weight and resources into your configuration for the time being, excuse me, we can still kind of retain this in terms of software instances. So this is how that is happening. So yeah, totally possible. So what we're looking at doing, so with those inserts, we're also assuming that insert is, just going back here for a moment, you'll notice that these do have names, and those are populated via some waves rack. So again, speaking to the term that both this converter speaks the SoundGrid language, and that we're working pretty much 100% in the SoundGrid domain here. So these are going to hit waves super rack racks for that. So backing up over here. So as we have those racks in place, we're just going to place the software instances that we'd want to use for some of these group processings in those groups in the same way that you would do it if you were then going to take that group and assign it without the external summing in a regular subgroup process. Now, after you've instantiated that processing piece, that's where you actually put the analog. The term for it in SuperRack is called external insert, and we're calling it the analog insert in path following the instances here. So what that does is that, I mean, if it were acting as a true full insert, we'd actually have a full send return on that. So that's where I want to spend a little bit of time just trying to be as clear as I possibly can on this next piece. So when I say use insert send on the summing mixer to drive input on corresponding converter inputs. So what I'm looking at there, just to kind of break that down a little bit, is that, so looking back up here, we've got the software instances here. We've instantiated an external insert piece here. Now, with that, with all those external insert functions, to kind of, I've got a few other visual examples later that actually have one of those instantiated and sort of viewed. So we'll get a chance to see what it looks like. But for all intents, what it is, it basically looks like you're just calling up a very, very simple looking, it looks kind of like the most basic plugin ever, except instead of having controls, what you have is a drop-down menu that allows you to select some of your hardware pieces that are available on your SoundGrid network. In my case, is either analog or digital inputs or outputs on the Apogee converter that I'm using for this. So what we're doing is when you actually call up the full, have that group up there, you've got your instances for your processing going on, and then you have your external insert. At that point, what we're doing is we're actually patching a full loop on that. So I'll just use a little bit of an example. That so for outputs, I think just to call it exactly by name, outputs 9 and 10 on the converter is where I'm patching my my drum dry, or this good cop group. So I'm putting both outputs 9 and 10 and inputs 9 and 10 on there. So for the inputs, all that's really doing in this case is basically just allowing us to return and see metering on the console. The inputs aren't on the converter, aren't used as part of a actual audio process, because it's all being spit out as soon as that line input hits this. And then the instances are in play because that takes place prior to this external insert. So that's kind of getting into this point here. So what we're doing is basically allowing ourselves to see metering on the desk. And by parking those physical faders at Unity, I'm just going to go back here. I know you can't see the faders from here, but you'll notice that their indicator here indicates that they are at 0 dB or Unity. So basically what that means is lets me see full resolution of the metering right here at both peak and RMS levels based off of how I have the ballistics set up on those meters. And so that just lets me see metering at a point in which I can actually pick the console metering based off of some of those preferences for both scale and an actual point of measure. But this also lets me see it basically. The main thing I want to see it is after the actual process, and I guess we are looking at how it's coming out of those channels, which is essentially just post the process of what's going on with what I am affecting in terms of the software instances. So I realize that may be some information I'm kind of bouncing around on a little bit, but all it is to say is that that's what allows me to use software processes while so keeping some of these actual group processes in the domain of software, but still getting the benefit of the summing side on the analog by spitting that sound out after it's already had a little bit of process done to it. So I'm just going to kind of this might help explain it a little bit more as I go through what some of these things look like. So here are a couple of these group processes. I just picked a mono or stereo and a mono one. So what we're looking at here on the upper left, this is the that drum path. So you know, the one that's actually called up here is the API 2500. Typically what I will as a go-to starting point for anything drum related. In this case, because it is the you know, this is the regular dry path, or the not super affected path. It is I have it instantiated basically for little tiny bit of flavor more than anything. You're really not seeing any gain reduction on that whatsoever. That's followed up by a Pultec EQ. Again, very, very minor tailor work happening there. Because on the crush group, I'm using another type of Pultec, which has the same latent path on it, that I am doing some aggressive EQing there. And then following that up with 550B. So that is their plug-in version of the 550B. I think it's actually the 5500 in API land. But that's the plug-in version of it there. And then this piece right here, it's kind of hard to see, but in this particular example, I think I have one where it's a little bit clearer coming up here soon. But that is that external insert path. And when you actually click on that or call it up in front of you on the screen, I'll kind of show you what that looks like on something else. So that's a stereo one. This is a mono one for bass guitar. And just a few things going on there. So the first one is the JJP bass plugin. It's got some really interesting tone shaping options that give me some flexibility, followed by parallel particles. That one I'm not really having to use it very much, but just a couple little things, flavor to taste there, followed by an F6. This particular bass guitar has a tendency to have a lot of information in the 60 to 80 sub region. So I'm using that twofold. One, to actually have a bit of a dynamic EQ process happening in that realm, but also to have a side chain from the bass drum around the 50 to 55 hertz fundamental of that. So that way it's all like they're not going to be competing so hard with one another. So there's a stereo and a mono group example of what that looks like. So you see software instances happening before that final piece labeled external insert. That's where it's going to get spit out into the summing mixer. And then looking at this next one here, so we got another stereo one. So this is the guitar group here. So starting that out with a Abbey Road Saturator, which has some really nice features and very interesting tonal flavor to it that lets you kind of make some really interesting aggressive moves while still maintaining a lot of musicality with that. I had that followed up with an API, the 560. So that's the one with the little with the small little faders. I think it was it's popular in a 500 rack type thing as well. It's for that one, really it's that center 1K fader that I just really like a lot. It's definitely just got a fun flavor, especially for electric guitars. Same thing here. So we're looking at an external insert. Now, this next one may be kind of hard to see. I don't know if it's actually chopped off here at the top of what it is, but this is actually the lead vocal. And you'll notice this is on that lead vocal group that's getting sent out to the summing mixer. You'll notice that there's no software on that. Again, going back to the fact that there's already hardware taking place. So this is actually not where the hardware is inserted per se, but this is where it's getting, again, spit out into that summing mixer. But you can see it a little bit more now here that basically you've got to send and a return on it. And so essentially that that return path, which is coming from the input side on the Symphony, is kind of what, for all intents, lets me just see metering because because what's taking place and what I'll get into here in just a moment is the fact that while we are able to see these pieces of metering, and that's important for things, the reality is the actual mix of these groups, both so all of a couple of these, both of these guys, and then a few more that I don't have photographs of here, but they are all part of the process, that they all get summed down into our bus drive portion. So again, just kind of going back over the fact, we have two discrete buses, stereo bus, and by default, if you don't push any buttons whatsoever, it's going to default to stereo bus 1. When you assign to bus 2, it defeats its assignment from bus 1, and then it's on bus 2. So stereo 1 or stereo 2. Obviously, talking over that again, each stereo bus has a master fader plus hybrid transformer saturation. We kind of went over what that is. And so here is where it gets a little interesting in terms of how things are going to actually happen on, basically what happens after it exits this summing domain. So after you have to decide how you're going to push that out into whatever it is you're driving, whether that is in a lot of cases, mine included with this, like I'm going back into the console because it makes the most sense in terms of a feasible and repeatable method of drive path. Some people may be going into something else. If you have a dedicated systems rack or something along those lines where you can just drive straight into that and never have to come back and hit the console, might be kind of a nice thing, especially if that enables you to have multiple inputs along with PA outputs, maybe some outputs for some dedicated like 2-mix printing or something along those lines. That may be a little bit more of a direct and discrete path for that matter. So what's going on with me is, so I'm merging into dedicated master buses, and it is 2 of them. So in the same sense that I have 2 stereo buses working, I'm going into the top side of 2, what essentially leaves me with 2 master faders on this overall band vocal mix. And so detailing a little bit of how I'm accomplishing that. So basically what that does mean is I do have to pick 2 pairs or 4 total inputs on that converter that are required for me to actually keep open on just the converter input side. So I can actually, at least I'm doing it in this converter just to try to keep everything coming in and out of the same box, essentially. Doesn't have to be that converter, but again, just for the sake of keeping it all contained, the system is ornate enough as it is. So I'm trying to keep pieces as tight as possible where I can. So with that, when I'm able to actually do that, put things into an input, into a couple of inputs on this converter, one of the nice features of Digico, obviously you've got a couple of different ways that you can actually get signal into the buses, or in this case, we're looking at the pair of master faders. But what I'm using is something called the merge input function, which what that means is that I can take the inputs from these converters, because you can basically pull any source from anywhere that exists on the console or console network, and basically tell it what to look at. Because of the fact that I'm coming back into a SoundGrid enabled converter, obviously it's looking at a couple of waves pairs of inputs, and these are both stereo buses. So I'll just go ahead and kind of outline what it is in my case. So for my case, I think I have inputs. It is kind of spread out on the converter a little bit, just for the sake of kind of where other things are falling around, and because I'm having to use some of those other inputs to see that metering ballistic on my console group screen. So again, it's a little bit spread out, but it's as sensible as I can get it. So what that is that I'm coming into inputs 7 and 8 analog on the Apogee, and then I'm taking those and then patching them to the factory Digico card on the console, and then I'm telling them, okay, wherever I have that input 7 and 8 from, which is the band fader, that's going back into the Digico waves card into another pair of things. I think I already had 7, 8 probably occupied with the Digico input 7 and 8. So I probably just picked something way down the line on that. Again, it's all one-to-one patchable in a patch bay type system. So basically did that. I think I actually ended up in 57 and 58. So analog input 7, 8 on the converter, patch to 57, 58 from on the Digico card, and then from there I just looked at the merge input feature on the Digico desk and said, okay, I'm now patching waves 57, 58 into the top of that bus. So that is because nothing else is assigned to that bus. That's what it sees. Same thing on the vocal. I think I have those going into another set of inputs. It's not 9 and 10. I think it's actually further on down the end on the Apogee side. I think it's actually all the way at the end, 23, 24. And then, so Apogee inputs 23, 24, they get patched into another set of inputs on the straight from the Apogee to the Digico Waves card, which I think I do have those corresponding. So those are going into 5960 into the vocal fader. So now what I have on the console is that basically I have both the, I'm going to go back over here to, we can see it on that screen a little bit. I'll just go ahead and pop it up here for nice and easy visuals. So I have this fader, which drives and is gonna be the assignment or sonic source for the band fader that exists on the console, and this is the one that exists for the vocal fader on the console. So from those, because now I have them back in the digital domain, I've done the analog summing, I've spit them out. Now I am going back into the console here, but from there, they're not going very far. So let me just kind of go over here. So this is how that's happening. So on every Digico console, you've got a matrix. In this case, SD9s have a 12 input, 8 output matrix. So let's take a look. You'll notice that. So this is the I actually have just a regular master fader set up that can do distribution in all PA drive zones, which are from top to bottom, and then matrix inputs are left to right. So yeah, it's cut off a little bit, but basically matrix input 1 and 2 are my main master fader, which doesn't have anything to do with the music mix on this side, but they get distributed to all portions of the PA plus the reference signal out to my analysis. These next two here, inputs 3 and 4, have to do with both the actual tuning and analysis portion of the console, as well as there's actually a bit of a macro situation happening here where some of these things will flip around based off of whether I'm actually doing PA measurement or console impulse alignment measurement. So that's kind of what's going on there. That's why I'm trying to keep things all in this matrix realm. Now, moving on over to here, inputs 5 through 8 on the matrix. So as you'll notice, I still have 9 through 12 that don't have anything assigned to these zones yet, just because I don't have a need to have them used for anything. But let's take a look at something. So we've got band left, right, that gets routed into, these are matrix drives. This is where everything hits the PA at this point. So we've got band left, right. So they go to the main left, main right. That's the main full range PA drive. Mono sum into a sub send, mono sum into a mono fill area. And then for the time being, I also have I could break these up if I needed to, but into multiple zones. But for right now, I actually have these two matrices outputs 5 and 6 set up as a stereo fill area type thing. So basically I have a main stereo and then I have a fill stereo that I can treat differently with level autonomy. Kind of nice to be able to have this kind of thing, especially as I'm I want to be able to have the offerings of as flexible of a type of output drive to be able to interface with whatever kind of situation I've got going on as far as whatever venue needs. For the most part, the ask on that case are left, right, sub, and fill. So that's why these are first up. But then, this next one can be a little like right now, I just have it set up as a stereo output option, but that can easily change over to a couple of mono ones, just sort of depending on what I need. So that's what's going on. So we'll notice that the band gets all of that. But an interesting point here is that looking over into the vocal matrix input side, so that's coming off of that, ultimately derived from that stereo bus 2 off of that Neve. They go into the left, right. They do not get assigned to the subs, and then they're in the monofill zone and the stereo option here. So the handy piece here is that while something to sort of consider. I mean, I think if you've watched any of my other stuff and know I'm a bit of a manual alignment kind of huge advocate, obviously, especially in this case when using a console that doesn't have any automatic delay compensation built in place. So basically at the mercy of what your regular impulse is. I mean, you can always figure it out, but that's one of the reasons why Digicode gives you the options to be able to look at things and be able to offer um, alignment methods, practices at sample resolution at pretty much any stage, with the trade-off being that you have the ultimate method of routing flexibility. You can route obviously inputs to groups, groups to groups, groups to auxiliaries, auxiliaries to groups. And I mean, anything you could possibly think of, this thing will probably do it at the trade-off of not offering any latent path compensation by default as an automatic process. But it gives you all the tools you need to be able to line these things up. In a lot of other cases, sometimes it's not as big of a deal when you are mixing a single entity, being a one band performing or music or something like that. It's very, very important to have your impulses align for these processes to work like they're designed and supposed to. But for things where you're a little bit more decorrelated in terms of, so it's talking heads or anything or a speaking portion or something like that that doesn't have, especially if they're in different zones, the need for them to be correlated and precisely, unless they are in a very, very tight group with one another, the needs vary in terms of what kind of actual homogeneous correlation are required there. Anyway, so not to get off too much on a tangent on that, but it's just basically as part of the process. And the big highlight here is that, so while I'm not doing a full aux-fed sub, because of this process and method, there is absolutely no way that that vocal fader can ever hit the subs because it's turned off. So, just in terms of an overall way to sort of clean things up that could possibly get a little muddy, there's one way to do it. If if the vocals can't hit the subs from an electronic standpoint, they're just not going to be able to get there. Meaning they can't cause any potential other stuff that would be destructive. Now, obviously, a lot of other things still can, but factoring in that, especially I have a lot of those things that are there that may or may not contain sub information. One, I do try to be judicious and careful with proper input filtering and things like that. So if it needs to be filtered out and not and the low end cleaned up out of it, I'm probably going to do that as aggressively as I have to in the high pass realm. The other side to that is that a lot of the sources that I'm working with right now are direct sources. Guitars, keyboards, bass included with that, meaning they're not going to be mic'd with an actual cabinet on stage. These are, they are on stage, they are live, but they're also straight into the mix system. So the chance of them, like a 57 on a stand that's going to pick up a lot of information that could be, even if it's electronically high passed, it could still be potentially distracting or detrimental to another part of the signal. It's just, it's much more tolerant of things like that when you do have things that are straight in. Obviously we still have things like high toms and overheads, stuff like that could that could technically make it in. But I mean, I'll go ahead and be very forward with a couple of numbers on that. My typical starting point for an overhead high pass in a live setting is 160. Sometimes I have to crank it up more than that. Starting point for a close mic hi-hat, over 300. Starting point for some of the higher toms, think the highest one's a little over 200, and the next one going down from that is about 160. The lower ones do have lower corners on them, but I do want those in the subs. In fact, some of those are actually going through the subharmonic synthesis process. So again, all a matter of taste, but I think I'm going to stop there on this because I realize I'm kind of starting to do this could spiral into a couple of multiple tangents. But anyway, kind of a little insight and take on how I'm doing some of the analog summing process, how it's actually getting from one place to another. And that's just kind of one little center portion of the analog rack that I'm doing. Hope you're all doing well and have a good rest of your day. All right. Cheers.